Hey guys! So this is going to be my first time practicing recording these PowerPoints so that I can kind of talk to you guys, but from a distance as we all be responsible and not spread the COVID. So here I go. I'm going to go through these slides and kind of talk you guys through it. All right, so this week, we are starting on the skeletal system. So your skeletal system, we kind of think of as being this sort of inanimate thing that just provides support for the body, right? Something hard for muscles to attach to, which it does. It is incredibly important for structural support. Without your skeletal system, you'd be just like a puddle of goo on the floor. Providing support is the number one function. But in addition to that, we have protection. Places of your skeletal system that provide protection to you are going to be your skull, for example. So your skull provides protection for the brain underneath of it. Your rib cage provides protection for all of those really important thoracic organs that are underneath it. In addition to that, your skeletal system is incredibly important for movement. Something rigid for your muscles to attach to so that your muscles can actually help move your skeleton around the body, or move your skeleton around the world. Um, and then storage. So we don't often think of this one, but your skeletal system is important for mineral storage. So most of the calcium storage in your body comes from your skeletal system. And we tend to think of maybe calcium is only good for the skeletal system, but we use calcium for a lot of other things in your body, which we'll be talking about in the next few weeks. In addition to that, hematopoiesis. So that's a long word that means the formation of blood. So all your blood cell production happens in your skeletal system. So bone marrow is incredibly important for the production of blood, right? And in addition to that, there's a little bit of triglyceride storage. You don't think about that too much either, but your bones store fat for you. Okay, so different types of bones in your body. So we classify bones based on their shape. So long bones are going to be any bones that are kind of longer than they are wide. So long bones would be like the bones of your arm, the bones of your legs, even like the bones of your fingers. These are considered long bones because they're longer than they are wide. In addition, short bones. Short bones are little squat kind of bones. They're almost like cube-like. So bones that are considered short bones are the ones that are in your wrist. So we've got a bunch of tiny little bones here in your wrist and in your ankle that are considered short bones. Um, Flat bones are ones that are flat. So flat bones we find in your skull. So the bones of your skull are considered flat bones, even though they're not totally flat. They're kind of curved, right? But because of the way they're structured, we consider them flat. Also, the bones of your sternum and your ribs are considered flat bones as well. Okay, so two more types of bones. Irregular bones. Irregular bones are ones that have an unusual shape to them that we don't classify as long or short or flat. So irregular bones are the ones that are in your spine, so the vertebrae have an irregular shape to them, and so do a lot of the bones of your face. So facial bones have an unusual shape, so we consider them irregular. Sesamoid bones are tiny little seed-shaped bones that tend to form in joints to help protect the joints. So sesamoid bones we find in most of your little joints. Usually they're too small and we don't even give them a name. But the one that does get a name is your patella. So patella is the one sesamoid bone that protects your knee joints. That's the largest sesamoid bone in the body. Okay, so here we can just see some examples of a few of these different types of bones. So humerus and your femur, those guys are considered the long bones. So again, because longer than they are wide. So long femur down here in your legs, long tibia, these are all considered long bones. Flat bones are the ones that have this kind of more flat shape to them. The irregular bones, like here's a vertebra, that's pretty irregular in shape. Sesamoid bones, like a little sesame seed. And then the short bones that are kind of the ones that we find in our wrists and our ankles that have a weird kind of cube-like shape to them. Okay, so let's talk about the different parts of a long bone, right? So we're going to be talking about the pieces and parts of most of the bones in your body, but we're going to use a long bone as the example because it's just kind of easier to understand using this as our example type of bone here. All right, so first let's look at the three different main parts or regions of this bone. All right, so the first region that we're going to talk about is the diaphysis. So diaphysis is this kind of long shaft of the bone. So diaphysis means the shaft of the bone. At the ends of the bone, then we've got two epiphyses. So we've got a proximal epiphysis, which is up here, and then we've got a distal epiphysis, which is down here. So remember, the proximal in terms of our limbs means closer to the point of origin. So this is, you're looking at the humerus, which is the bone of the arm here. So proximal means closer to the point of origin. So this proximal epiphysis would be at the shoulder. This distal epiphysis down here we would find closer to the elbow. So that's where we're going to find the distal epiphysis of the bone. Right. A couple more words I want to point out on this picture here. One is this word periosteum. So periosteum means, peri means around, osteum means bone. So the periosteum is this kind of sheet of connective tissue that covers the outside of the bones. Right here they've got it kind of like cut and folded backwards so you can see that it's this wrapping around the outside of the bone. We've got a similar structure on the inside, so here's that word, endosteum. So endo means within, osteum means bone. So the endosteum is this kind of lining on the inside of the medullary cavity. All right, and so a medullary cavity is the hollow part of the inside of the bone where we find the bone marrow. All right, so medullary cavity, we hold two different types of bone marrow. So in the diaphysis of the long bones, medullary cavity in adults mostly holds yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is where we store fats, so that's triglyceride storage. Towards the epiphyses, so here in this kind of region up here, we find more red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is where hematopoiesis happens, or the formation of blood cells. That's what's happening in that red marrow. Also, one more thing to note, let me kind of erase this so we can see a little bit better here. One more thing to look at here around the outside of the epiphyses of these long bones. So here we've got articular cartilage, so they're highlighting that there. Articular cartilage is what's covering the ends of the long bones so that we can protect the bones where they come together to form joints. Right, so this articular cartilage here would be in the form of hyaline cartilage, and then we've got hyaline cartilage down at the bottom of that bone as well. Okay, so one more thing to look at when we're looking at the structure of a long bone are the epiphyseal lines or the epiphyseal growth plates. Right, so this is how long bones get longer, right? So we all start off as tiny little fetuses, and those tiny little fetus bones have to get longer and longer and longer as we get bigger. So long bones grow from a region known as the epiphyseal growth plate. So the epiphyseal growth plate we find as kind of like the barrier between the diaphysis of the bone and the epiphysis on the end. So right in between where those two come together, that's where we find the epiphyseal plate. So this epiphyseal plate is where lengthening happens of the bone. And then when you reach adulthood, it stops. And that epiphyseal growth plate will seal shut. And we just call it the epiphyseal line at that point because it's no longer growing. But in children and babies and pretty much everyone up until the point of when you're about 20 years old or so is when that the lengthening of the long bone stops. Okay, so here we can see that that epiphyseal line a little bit better. So I'm just going to kind of highlight it here for you. I'm doing a really bad job at the highlighting, but so the epiphyseal line, again, that's where the epiphysis and the diaphysis have now sealed together because growth has stopped. So we would find that epiphyseal line visible on x-rays and stuff, but it's after the adulthood point where the bones are no longer getting any longer. But we can see that line here. Okay, so in this slide, we can see that articular cartilage a little bit better. So we're kind of zoomed in at the end here so we can see this articular cartilage. So that articular cartilage is going to be mostly hyaline cartilage, and that's just protecting the ends of the long bones where two bones come together to form a joint. All right, so moving on to the next slide here. Here we're zoomed in so we can see that periosteum a little bit better. So again, periosteum being this kind of outer covering of a bone. So the kind of a fibrous sheet of connective tissue that's covering the outside of the bone. We also have on the inside of the medullary cavity here. So again, medullary cavity is this region on the inside of the bone where we find bone marrow. The medullary cavity is lined by its own sheet of fibrous connective tissue. That one's called the endosteum. Again, endo means within, osteum means bone. So that's the lining of the inside of the bone. All right, so let's talk about the flat bones here a little bit. So we've been mostly focusing on the structure of the long bones. Flat bones are pretty similar, but we can see here a couple things to note here. We don't have epiphysis and diaphysis because of just the shape of the bones here. What we do have are two sheets of compact bone. So compact bone forms the inside and layer of this bone, and then within those two we have a layer of spongy bone. Spongy bone is also called cancellous bone. So this spongy bone is what's creating kind of the inside area of the flat bone. And now we also have spongy bone in your long bone. So I maybe didn't point it out in that earlier slide, but in the epiphyses of the long bones is where we find a lot of spongy bone. And wherever you find spongy bone, that's where you're going to find, so spongy bone like right here is where you're going to find the red bone marrow. You'll find it in that spongy bone. Okay, so a lot of terminology on this slide. So this slide comes from your learning maps. I would recommend familiarizing yourself with some of this terminology. These are words that basically refer to markings on bones. So the bone markings could be kind of bumps on the outside of a bone. They could be lines on the outside. They could be kind of holes or depressions or cavities. And they all are going to have different names to them. So for example, like a facet, so let me highlight that. A facet is a flat surface on a bone. So let me find one on here. So here's a facet here on your femur, which is the bone of your thigh. The facet on that bone is going to be the part that's a flat surface that's going to articulate with another bone. So in that case, the facet on the end of the femur there articulates with your patella, which is your kneecap. We can also let's find some other ones here. A spine is a sharp process of bone. So I don't see any in any of these bones here, but there's a little spine back here on your skull. Spines are just these sharp processes of bone that usually are there to hold muscles, right, for muscle attachment. Crests is going to be a ridge of bone. So here's a crest on your iliac. So the iliac is this bone of your hip here. Crest is kind of this ridge on the outside of the bone there. So other ones to note here. A fossa is a basin, kind of like a hollow depression in a bone. So we find fossas, for example, right here on your humerus. So this fossa is there for articulation with the bones of your forearm. So particularly the ulna kind of grabs into that fossa of the humerus, and that's how we get an elbow joint. And then foramen are holes. So any kind of hole that you find in a bone is probably foramen. All right, so talking about the tissue here, what's actually composing this bony tissue? Right, so bone itself is hard, mineralized tissue. It's not dead. It's actually living tissue, but it's created from this hard minerals that give it its strength. Right, so most of the bone is mineral salts. So that means inorganic minerals like calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate. And then we also find some magnesium in there, but mainly it's calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. So, and sometimes you'll just hear me refer to it as hydroxyapatite. So hydroxyapatite are these mineral salts that give bone its hardness. Right, so that's the inorganic side of what's composing bone. The organic side is protein, right? So there's a lot of collagen fibers. The collagen, those are organic proteins in there, are what's going to give bone a little bit of its flexibility, so it's not just like super brittle. So a lot of the kind of the pliability of your bones, the fact that they're a little bit flexible, the fact that they don't just kind of shatter all the time, is because of the collagen fibers in there that provide some of that flexibility and tensile strength. Okay, so here talking about the two main different types of bone that we have. So compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is the bone that we find that creates most of the strength. So compact bone is, if we look at this picture here, all of this part of this is compact bone. So it's very compact, right? So the all of the mineralized components are packed right up next to each other, and we've got this very thick compact bone. We find compact bone lining lining most of like your flat bones. So the flat bones that had that kind of sandwich-like structure, compact bone on the outside, compact bone on the inside, and then in between those two is where you would find spongy bone. Compact bone is all lining all the diaphyses of your long bone, so giving strength to the diaphyses. And then in the middle is where we find this kind of spongy bone. Right, so spongy bone is this um, it's more like a web-like bone, so that it's not super compact right next to each other. We've got these kind of web-like, what we call trabeculae of bone. And that bone is really important to lighten your skeleton, right? So if all your bone were compact bone, your skeleton would be way too heavy to move around. So we need spongy bone in there to kind of lighten the load. It still adds strength. It still is important for creating structure, but it's not quite as heavy, right? So your bones, your skeleton would be way too heavy if you only had compact bone. All right, so yeah, compact bone, good for protection and support. So this again, mostly in the diaphysis of the long bones. Here we've got a better view of the spongy bone. So spongy bone, much lighter in weight because we've got these spaces between what are known as the trabeculae. So all of these little finger-like projections here, these are trabeculae. So the spaces between the trabeculae of the spongy bone, we've got free space, and that's where we find a lot of red marrow in between the trabeculae of the spongy bone. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the functional unit of bone. So a functional unit is just like a small building block, think of an entire tissue. So for bone, the functional unit of bones are called Haversian systems or osteons, right? So two names interchangeable there. So Haversian system and an osteon are referring to the same thing. Let me go ahead and highlight one for you so we can see what we're looking at here. How do we do this? All right, so here, let me just circle one of these Haversian systems or osteons. So this is the tree trunk kind of thing that we were looking at in the lab the other day. So here's one in the actual picture. Here's one in the micrograph. So we've seen this under the microscope last week in lab. So each one of those circular shapes here, and here's another one, and here's another one. Each one of these circular shapes here is a Haversian system or an osteon. Right, and so when we have a whole bunch of those Haversian systems or osteons all packed together, that's what gives us bone. All right, so let's look at the structure of those osteons a little bit more closely. We can see in the middle of each osteon, so here's one where we can see the middle of it. In the middle of each osteon, we've got a central canal or a Haversian canal. Within that central canal is where we are going to find blood vessels. So we're going to find an artery and a vein, and also a nerve. Right, so remember that bony tissue is living tissue, which means there's living cells in there that need access to oxygen and nutrients. They also need to eliminate carbon dioxide and wastes. So that's happening through those blood vessels that go through the central canal. And also this is tissue that has feeling to it. So we've got a nerve going through there too. Now, around each central canal, we've got these rings of tissue, and those rings of tissue that are kind of surrounding the central canal, those are called lamellae. So lamellae means, the word itself means layers. So think like when you laminate something, you add a layer to it. So a lamella is a layer that's around the central canal. Right, so each one of these central canals has multiple layers that are going around it. Those are the lamellae. So that's what's creating these rings around the central canal. Um, inside those lamellae, we have tiny little holes. Those tiny little holes are called lacunae. So here's that word. So lacunae just means little lake or little hole. So these little lakes that are within the lamellae are where we find actual osteocytes. So osteo, here's that word. Osteo means bone, cyte means cell, so osteocytes are actual bone cells. So the bone cells live inside the lacunae, and the lacunae are the little lakes that are inside the lamellae, and the lamellae are the concentric rings that go around our central canal. Okay, so I mentioned osteocytes being bone cells, but those aren't the only bone cells that you have. So osteocytes we usually refer to as being mature bone cells, but then we've got a couple other different types of cells that are important to point out here. So osteoblasts, osteoblasts are cells that build bone. Bone is constantly being remodeled, which means we're adding more bony tissue or we're taking away bony tissue and we're kind of changing the shape of the bones. So osteoblasts are the ones that build bone. So blasts build. We also have osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are cells that dissolve bone. So they break down unneeded bone so that we can remodel our bone. So if we look at the picture over here, so this would be looking at a cross-section of a trabecula. So the parts of the little finger-like projections in spongy bone. We can see that we've got lamellae here. So the lamellae are these the little rings. We don't have central canals in the trabeculae of spongy bone, but we do still have the lamellae. And then within the lamellae, we've got the lacunae. So lacunae, that little lake. And then inside the lacunae, we've got the osteocytes, which are mature bone cells. But then if we look at the outside here, so let's look at the outside a little bit. So the outside here is where we find actual osteoblasts. So let me circle some of these osteoblasts. So the osteoblasts are on the outside, they're building new bone. So they're going to keep building new bone, especially if you think about in kids that are still growing. They're going to be building new bone. As they build new bone, they're basically taking minerals out of your bloodstream, so calcium phosphate, calcium carbonate out of your bloodstream and using those minerals to deposit new bony tissue. As they deposit new bony tissue, then they get locked inside of it, and that's how these lacunae form. So eventually, osteoblasts, as they're building new bony tissue, will be walled off, and as they get walled off by the tissue they're creating, they will become osteocytes. So that as they build new tissue, they become these mature bone cells that are kind of trapped inside the bone that they've just built. All right, over here, let me point out the osteoclast. So here's an osteoclast. He is their dissolving bone. So if we want to change the shape of our bone, if we want to reallocate where we're adding strength to the bone, then that's where osteoclasts come in. So they're constantly eating away bone. So say we need more calcium in your bloodstream, calcium to do other things in the body, then we would want to activate those osteoclasts to start dissolving some bones so that we can get some of that calcium back into the blood circulation. Okay, quick note on cartilaginous tissue. So cartilage is also an important part of your skeletal system. So remember that we've got hyaline cartilage that's covering the ends of the long bones. We've also got fibrocartilage that creates these intervertebral discs here. So the discs that are between your vertebrae, so creating a cushion for your vertebrae and supporting a lot of weight. Cartilaginous tissue is in a lot of ways, the structure is very similar to bony tissue. We don't have the central canals or lamellae, but we do have lacunae. So remember, lacunae are the little lakes or little holes where the actual cells live. So in the cartilaginous tissue here, so we can see some hyaline cartilage, we can still see these lacunae. So let me circle one. So the lacunae is the little lake, and then inside that little lake we've got a cell. In this case, it's instead of being a bone cell, an osteocyte, it's a chondrocyte. So chondrocyte means cartilage cell, right? So that's going to be the basic structure of all types of cartilage, whether it's hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage or elastic cartilage. Okay, so looking at bone marrow, so bone marrow, we've got the two major types, which I mentioned a little bit earlier in the show here. So red bone marrow is the bone marrow that's responsible for hematopoiesis, or the formation of blood cells, and that means that's where you form your red blood cells, where you form your white blood cells. All blood cells are made in red bone marrow. So that red bone marrow we find usually within the trabeculae of spongy bone. So we find it in the epiphyses of the long bones, and then also within the flat bones where you find a lot of spongy bone is where you get most of your red bone marrow. And then in the diaphyses of long bones is where we find yellow marrow. And yellow marrow is mostly for triglyceride storage, so that's mostly fatty. So we find a lot of that fatty yellow bone marrow in the diaphyses of long bones. All right, so we made it to the end of our first little short recorded lecture here. So question here, what type of cartilage do we find at the pubic symphysis or between our vertebrae of our spine? So remember that we've got cartilage there. So what kind of cartilage do you think you find in between your vertebrae and at the pubic symphysis? I'll give you a second to respond, think about it. All right, so the answer for that one is fibrocartilage. So between the pubic symphysis and between the vertebrae is fibrocartilage. What type of cartilage covers the ends of your moving bones? So the ends of the long bones where joints come together. What type of cartilage do you think that is? Okay, if you said hyaline cartilage for that one, then you are correct. Yep, so hyaline cartilage is covering the ends of the joints or the moving bones. All right, and then moving on to another couple questions here. So what type of bone forms the diaphysis of the long bones? So the diaphysis meaning the long shaft of those bones. What type of bone do you think forms that? Okay, so if you said compact bone, you would be right. So the diaphyses of your long bones are made of compact bone. And what type of bone forms inside the epiphyses? So on the inside of the epiphyses of long bones, what type of bone is there? Okay, so if you said spongy bone or cancellous bone, you would be correct. So the insides of the epiphyses is where we find that spongy bone, are also called cancellous bone.